Hello, I'm Zachary Pringle, and I am a graduate student here at the University of Michigan Flint, and I am in the Fast Track program. I am doing my presentation on detecting atrial fibrillation from photoplethysmograms. So the main goal of this article was to come up with an algorithm that could predict atrial fibrillation using a wearable device. The idea of having a health monitor wherever you are within a watch could have a huge impact on the health of many people. It's exciting to see how far technology and data has come, and it allows us to predict so many things such as health problems, products people will buy, whether promises of candidates running for president make fake news or not. So these advancements are necessary since our health and well-being are important, and something as simple as wearing a watch could save your life. Atrial fibrillation is the most common arrhythmia of the heart and affects upward of 6.1 million adults just in the United States alone. That is scary in itself, but that number is also expected to double over the next 25 years. So PPG works by using optical lensing, and this lens is able to scan and detect changes in the blood volume in the tissues. And then from this change in blood pressure, a binary output can be created that says the subject either has AF or not. So PPG sensors work a little differently than electrocardiograms, and they're a little less invasive, which is great. They're often found in smartwatches, and they can be used to scan free living subjects, unlike electrocardiograms can. The watch that was used specifically in this article was a Samsung wrist wearable device, and it has a sampling frequency of 20 hertz. And it can also calculate the triaxial acceleration, which determines how much motion occurred and can account for some of the errors that might occur. So the way that they went about solving the solution was to constantly scan the changes in blood pressure with the watch, and then break that scan down into 30-second segments. Each of the scans were ran and trained in these neural networks to find a best model to give the most accurate representation of atrial fibrillation. And this is called a convolution neural network. And in the end, it produces a binary code. So there's 49 layers of convolution, and then there's one global averaging pooling layer, which is the layer that spits out the binary code. So the data used was from two different data sets, and they were used to train the neural network model. The first data set had 402 recordings from 29 different subjects. 13 of those 29 subjects had persistent atrial fibrillation. 2 of them had a normal sinus rhythm, and the other 14 had rhythms that changed over time, including 8 other arrhythmias besides atrial fibrillation. The other data set contained 341 readings, and that was from 53 subjects. And the 53 were reported to have no arrhythmic symptoms beforehand. And then the 743 different readings were broken down into 510,556 different 30-second readings. And any data that was deemed to be noisy from the model was discarded, which made up about 1% of the data. So after cleaning up the data, the final test set contained 147,968 records from the first test set and 47,879 records from the second. 45% of the subjects were labeled as having persistent atrial fibrillation. 33% of those were labeled as persistent normal sinus rhythm, and 22% were labeled as having multiple different rhythms, but a total of 50.2% were labeled with having atrial fibrillation at some point. The models were then compared based on their area under the curve that they created. So one of the main problems that was occurring was to do with motion, and anytime a subject was moving too much in the past, this was causing inaccuracies in the reading, and it was not able to be done on free living subjects. So to counter this, there was a motion intensity reading that was added into the model, so it would learn based on the movements of people and could better predict the outcome, whether they had atrial fibrillation or not. So the model was able to obtain an area under the curve of 94.8%. The baseline did not get worse as motion increased, which means that they were successful with their model and their prediction in free living people. The main error was coming from extreme levels of noise, which is something that is hard to fix because it's either someone wasn't wearing the watch correctly or moving so much that it couldn't be read. The number dropped to 85.5% when they were looking at the mixed readings and the partial atrial fibrillation, and this was due to the constant changes in blood pressure, and it was a little harder to read and come up with a model that fit it best. And also part of the problem was that the partial atrial fibrillation did not have as many test subjects, so the model didn't learn as much as it did from constant stuff like the sinus rhythm and the constant atrial fibrillation. This image shows an example of pretty much how the model would interpret data that it brought in. So the original reading was a bit tough and a bit hard to read and didn't really give any pressure related data back. But from that, it was able to come up with a first derivative which cleaned out the noise and gave clean peaks. And then from there, it was able to get a closer reading with the second derivative, and the third derivative finally gave the systolic and diastolic peaks, which were able to read and determine whether they had atrial fibrillation or not. So one of the best parts about this model is that it would learn based on the recordings to best know if atrial fibrillation was present or not. So like the top recording shows the salient regions, and they're the important parts, which are highlighted in the dark blue, and they help to show that the recording is a normal sinus rhythm and that the chances of atrial fibrillation to occur are at 0.0001. The second reading is to show the strong presence of atrial fibrillation, and where the important recordings are found for this one are the highlighted in the darker red sections, and this reading gives a 0.993 probability that the subject would have atrial fibrillation. And based on the differences in the models, you could see slightly like kind of what the model looks for in differences. And the model could even tell differences between the atrial fibrillation rhythms and rhythms that occurred other than the normal sinus rhythm, which I thought was pretty interesting. So the data was put into t-SNE plots, which show clustering. The first one shows clustering of atrial fibrillation records compared to the non-atrial fibrillation records. And the atrial fibrillation records tended to stay to the left of the graph, and they spread higher vertically, while the non-atrial fibrillation records are mostly to the right and are found pretty centralized in the graph. They are a bit more wide than the atrial fibrillation, but they're found mostly on the right half. The second graph shows a t-SNE plot based on the motion intensity. And the higher the motion intensity, the darker the point was on the graph. So the higher motion seemed to cluster mostly in the bottom left, while the lesser of the motion was found in the upper right parts of the graph. So this graph shows how strong that their model actually worked. It shows that even as the intensity increased, the area under the curve was staying steady and at a high rate. And it shows how much better it was doing than the baselines from previous tests and how it degraded as the strength increased. The interesting part was that the lowest 20% of both of the baseline and the model that they used actually had some of the hardest times finding the atrial fibrillation. And they suggested that it could be due to people wearing the watch improperly, or that there were some other functionality problems when the motion intensity was that low. So in this one, the first graph here shows the standard deviation of the motion intensity scores and their proportions of the data that they made up. Most of the data that was found had a very low amount of motion intensity, and as the intensity rose, the proportion gradually went down. The second half shows the RLC curves and how the model came up with an area under the curve of 0.9478, while the baseline that was used came up with a 0.6099. This helps to prove that they were able to accurately predict when atrial fibrillation was in the free living subjects, just using the wristwatch, and these types of findings will be huge in the medical industry and could save so many lives. The importance of data found every day is crucial to how people will live their lives in the future. So this is the reference that I used for this presentation. So if you guys have any questions, please feel free to email me at my email below or send me a message on Slack. Thank you for letting me do my presentation.